This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
My guest today is Michigan's only incoming freshman Republican in Congress. Tom Barrett is a Republican. He was a 22-year Army veteran, and he's a former Michigan lawmaker as well. 2 years ago, Barrett ran against Alyssa Slotkin for a Lansing area Congress seat and lost. This time, he ran against a Gretchen Whitmer ally, Curtis Hertel Jr., and won. And now Mr. Barrett goes to Washington. Barrett's journey is going to be an interesting one to watch. By all accounts, Tom Barrett is exactly the kind of man you'd want to send to Washington. As a Michigan lawmaker, Barrett pushed back against the corporate welfare consensus. He said what Michigan enjoyers know to be true, that if General Motors wants to build a plant, it can call the bank. This need not involve taxpayer money. Barrett said that corporate welfare doesn't create jobs for the people of Michigan. It creates headlines for the politicians of Michigan. 2 years ago, he was punished for this when Slotkin presented Barrett as a Philistine, an enemy of progress. This time around, Barrett was vindicated for it. Not only did he win his race, but to win hers, Slotkin had to run from her former self. Slotkin went from signing NDAs and supporting the Goshen Project in Big Rapids to outright opposing it, citing national security grounds. And so when the wind blew and the world changed, it moved in the direction of reality. And when that happened, Tom Barrett was there standing on the solid rock. But we call Washington a swamp for a reason, and it's not just the humidity. D.C. is a nice place, far away from family in your district. In D.C., a congressman has a staff, access to many new friends who want to help you. You have elderly colleagues who mentor you, and sometimes those favors are called in. Your new friends fundraise for you, and those favors are always called in. In D.C., you have power. You can feel like a master of the universe. Next thing you know, you're in the bonfire of the vanities. Add in media pressure and political considerations, and it's easy for a good man to emerge from that swamp unrecognizable. This happens to politicians in Lansing, of all places. It doesn't just happen in Washington. Everything about D.C. is engineered to make it happen. The swamp exists to bend knees that don't want to be bent, using a combination of favors and force. There are offers made that can't be refused. And so I'm praying for Tom Barrett as he navigates the swamp, and we'll be following his journey there. Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the Enjoyer Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and a lot to take in. And you're right; these are real challenges that we have in this country, and real things that we have to be mindful about. You're exactly right.
Absolutely. We'll start here. What do you enjoy about Michigan?
Well, right now, I most enjoy the Detroit Lions. So I was sharing with some folks recently. I was actually voted most optimistic of my high school class. I graduated in the year 2000, and I believe my classmates voted me most optimistic because I thought it was the Lions' year every year. And
you were that
right
guy.
Now. I
there was one of those guys at every school. You were that guy at your school.
Yeah. So this is the year. This is it.
Were you also a Barry Sanders truther? Did you keep thinking that he was going to come back maybe this year, this year?
Yeah. What did he retire? Was it 99 or 2000 that he left?
Right in there.
Yeah.
And as late as like 2004 with Steve Mariucci, there was always, might Barry come back?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. No, I did accept reality that, when Barry retired, I think he was done. And I think, that was pretty apparent by the unfortunate reality of what the Lions were going through at that time and everything else. But they got a great season going. Everybody loves what they're doing. And my son, so I have an 11-year-old son now. He's my oldest, and he has really gotten into football a lot. So it's so fun to kind of be able to vicariously live through those experiences that he's having and the excitement that comes with it. And we went and actually drove to Indianapolis the weekend before Thanksgiving to watch Lions play there. And that was fun to be able to do together as a good, father-son bonding moment. And we had a lot of fun. So it's good. So love the Lions, of course. They're doing great. But really, my family's in Michigan. And I think for all of us, you grow where you're planted and you
Yeah.
raise a family of your own. My wife and I are doing that in mid-Michigan in the small town of Charlotte. Most of my family's in the Detroit area where I grew up. And, we think about, of course, family and where you are and, the generations before you, the generations to come after you and what that looks like. And, of course, we are fortunate in Michigan to have an abundance of Great Lakes and drive the
Yes.
kids over to Holland on the lakeshore in the summertime. And I'm not a big fan of winter outdoor activities, but at the same time can appreciate the diversity of the seasons in Michigan too. So there's a lot to be proud of in Michigan. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Donald Trump, he's talked about the DC swamp, and at this point, he's vowed to drain it for about a decade now.
Hmm.
As you look at it, you're there now. Work's
Hmm.
about to start. What are the snares of the DC swamp, and how does a
Yeah.
freshman go about avoiding those?
I think you have to have an awareness of what you're up against and what you're facing and the knowledge of that. The best lesson I learned in the Army after 22 years, the best lesson I learned in the Army was to never have a dislocation of expectations. So you
Mm,
have to confront everything with the knowledge of what you're up against. If you go into it thinking it's going to be all rosy, it's not. I mean, governing is hard. Serving an elected office is hard. You mentioned a lot of the challenges that come with that. People want to take aim at you and criticize decisions that you make. And, oftentimes they're imperfect decisions that you have to decide what's the best that you can do. And that's something that I've grown a little more comfortable with in the time that I served in the state legislature, knowing that I was going to do
right.
things that I felt were important, that weren't always going to be the things that, attracted the most praise and headlines and everything else, but where I felt it was important. I wanted to plant my feet and do what I thought was the right thing to do in the moment. And I think coming out here to Washington, I want to take that experience that I have. I'm not here to be disruptive to the entire, obligation that we have to govern this country. But I do want to do the right thing by the people that elected me, the right thing by the people of Michigan and by this country to have this opportunity to really not let it go to waste, to bring about fundamental changes that we need to have here in our country for sure.
Yeah. When I think about the roots of how I became a conservative as a young man, I mean, this was as a teenager. My hope was always that Republicans would break the cookie jar. Instead, what I found during the Bush years and then in Michigan during the Snyder years, my former colleague James Holman at Mackinac Center, he had a great chart about this on Twitter, where since 2003 there was this corporate welfare consensus that has gripped Lansing, and that
Hmm.
includes 8 years of Rick Snyder, who also had uh, Republicans held all the gavels back then. So
Hmm.
Republicans had every opportunity to go the other way and to break that consensus. Instead, they solidified it.
Hmm.
And so why didn't you were in Lansing for a piece of this? Why didn't Republicans break that cookie jar in Lansing? What
Hmm.
makes you think the national Republicans can break it in Washington?
Yeah, and I'm far more familiar with, of course, Lansing, having just served there more recently, and I of course haven't even been sworn in yet in Washington. I'm going to be learning this as I go, but I can say one of the frustrations I had, and I'm going to say this with all respect for the colleagues I had during the tenure that I served in the state legislature, is I think we often fall into this trap that Republicans take a majority or Republicans win a race. We're going to run these programs better than the Democrats. And we don't ever
Yes.
question, are these programs even good to
Mm,
begin with? And instead of asking or trying to do the thing of just running them better, we ought to be asking if they're even merited to begin with. And there's always this desire to go out and get those headlines and take credit for creating jobs or doing amazing things that you're not actually doing. Every lawmaker, I observed who voted for these deals, often, they were drawn to this idea that they're going to wear the hard hat and go to the ribbon cutting and the little shovel picture in the ground and put it on their website and take credit for creating jobs. And I reminded my colleagues, the only jobs we create here are government jobs.
Yes.
Everything else is done by the private sector. Really, we only create jobs that are in government. And I don't think anybody's out there saying we need to add a whole lot more government jobs to the payroll right now. So I think we need to be mindful of that. I also looked at a lot of data that showed that, when you look at corporate executives of where they want to locate, incentives actually are low on that list. But things that the legislature ought to be tackling, infrastructure, workforce development, energy costs, right to work status, all of those were much higher on that list of priorities. And we only have to pay incentives to make up for deficiencies higher up on that list. If your number one criteria in consideration is what kind of workforce do you have in place and what type of education and training do they have, why aren't we putting our focus there instead of paying, in the case of General Motors, $680 million for them to come build something, and
Wouldn't
then they sell it
if
3
our
weeks
eighth
after the
graders
election.
could read, if that's
Right.
what people want, right?
Right.
It just, the answers
That's messy,
stare you in the
right?
face. And so
Yeah.
what ends up happening is this corporate welfare, not
Yeah.
only does it not create jobs, it's just enough of a Band-Aid that lets you think that the economy is actually working and that
Yeah.
we're doing as good as we can.
Yeah.
And late in the election season in 2022, Gretchen Whitmer actually sent out, no, it was actually even after that, it was after the election, so she didn't need to do this anymore. She sent out a press release taking credit for 34 jobs.
Yeah.
Now, we laugh at the smallness of it, but the meta, the thing behind the thing is they're trying to create, by the smallness of it, the impression that every job in Michigan must trace back to the governor somehow.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
And
if
so
that's the
Republicans had a
source-
chance to say, that's not how the economy works. I'm Rick
Yep.
Snyder. I'm a businessman. I can tell you that's not how it works. And they
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And there's a lot of fundamental psychological, reasons why and reasons why not. But to your point, if you believe that everything originates and stems from the government, then yes, the government gives and takes and all these other things along the way. And why wouldn't you want to chase the power to be able to do that? But again, you look at the data, you look at the reasons why, all of these other things that far outweigh these incentives. But no one wants to do the messy work of going in and figuring out how we're going to get, elementary school students to read at a higher rate, how we're going to bring down the cost of energy in Michigan and maybe challenge some of the big giants in the room that have powerful lobbyists that, allow you to kick the can down the road with the status quo. And maybe we're going to have to challenge what happens with right to work. Michigan's the only state to reverse that after going to a right to work state to then turn around and reverse that. We're the only state in the union to do that reversal. A lot of these things,
dubious distinction.
Yes, and that's a top 5 criteria when a company's looking at where they're going to locate, an expansion that they're looking to do. So, these are all
speak to
things
that? Could you speak to that? Because I have talked often on this show, make Detroit build again. And as I see it, let's say Donald Trump said, look, I'm going to bring 10,000 jobs back to Michigan. If they were auto jobs, they'd still have to deal with Sean Fain. So could you talk about how that is an obstacle to Michigan's rebirth?
Well, you even look at the most recent evidence of General Motors selling their position in the battery plant that they had that major incentive for that you highlighted in your introduction, the way in which it was leveraged in a political campaign against me. 3 weeks after this year's election, they sell their position in that plant. I believe in large part because they wanted to get out from the union scale wages at that particular plant. So the existing battery plants that are a joint venture with GM were paying far below the union scale wages that the UAW had negotiated in their most recent contract. Well, if General Motors is no longer the partner in the agreement, the follow-on entity, LG, which is based out of South Korea and is not a UAW affiliated corporation, does not then have to honor the General Motors union agreement. So those, it's to be determined what the wage scale and everything else at this plant will be if in fact it is opened and continued as promised. But at the very least, we know that it is not going to be under the control of the UAW unless they go and unionize that plant no different than they could, anywhere else in America if they were to choose to do that. But starting out, this is not going to fall under the control of the master agreement with the UAW with this arrangement that was kind of promised, if you will, to
Good paying
people.
jobs.
Yeah,
I guarantee they threw that
and
phrase around.
they did. They did.
And so union guys, if you're listening, auto workers for Trump, we've had you on the show. The okey doke affected you too.
Yes.
Because this was not the tide that lifted all ships.
Here's the other thing. The UAW voted down their most recent contract. They voted it down at the Lansing Delta Township plant where they make the Traverse and the other, affiliated vehicle platforms for that. They're at Delta Township for General Motors. That plant voted the contract down, but the battery plant workers got the final contract over the finish line to get it ratified. And now those same battery plant workers that would be filling jobs at the Delta Township battery plant are now going to be working for LG, and they're not going to be covered by the UAW contract. So the only way they got that contract finished was with battery plant worker votes. Because again, the existing plant workers in Delta Township voted it down. They had battery plant workers nationally voted just enough to get it over the top to ratify the contract to end the strike. And now, the newest plant there is one that is being shifted entirely away. So it's a little bit like a bait and switch, you might say. I've conveyed that to General Motors, the frustration I felt that there were some promises definitely that were made. There was a large check that was written. The amount of money that the state of Michigan is paying for these, it was over $150,000 for every single job. And the jobs, prior to the UAW stepping in to promise better wages, were starting around $18 an hour. So we're paying $150,000 for them to turn around and pay somebody $18 an hour. So even
which is $36,000. Where's the rest of that money going?
Well, exactly. Where do you think these global corporations with high-powered lobbyists influence the process and get the money out of it? That, as you said, if we're paying the workers $36,000 to $40,000 a year, but we're paying the corporation $150,000 to employ them, I don't know. I'm not Warren Buffett. I'm just some guy in
as the kids would say,
Michigan.
The math ain't mathin'.
Right. So
Tom Mallory McMorrow, a state senator. I think you guys caught each other in Lansing, former colleague.
We served in the state Senate for 4 years at the same time.
Yeah, she said something fascinating the other day on Instagram, that she goes against the conventional wisdom and said basically all politics is national these days. That even in little Lansing, there's the national influence there. I would argue that's not healthy. My shirt says make news local again.
Yeah.
And I think about Tip O'Neill, right? I mean, so we have a former Democrat House Speaker who said all politics is local. We have a Michigan state senator saying all politics is national nowadays. Is there a way, as you head into Congress, is there a way to represent a Michigan agenda even at the national level? Or is McMorrow right that you're going to get dragged into these national battles as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'm going to do my best to make a focus on, of course, the issues that are important to Michigan, but the same issues that are important to folks in my district are probably important to folks across the country too.
Right.
People sent a message to Washington by, reelecting Donald Trump saying the status quo isn't working.
Tom, I want to thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you got a lot to do in Washington. And we are going to be watching. We are going to be watching what happens next. Mr. Barrett goes to Washington, and I'm so fascinated to see what happens then. A lot of people don't really have a character to lose, but Barrett has a head on his shoulders. He knows where he comes from. He knows who sent him, and he knows why they sent him to Washington. And so I think Tom Barrett knows exactly what's at stake right now. I think he knows everyone's up for re-election in 2 years. And so we're going to be watching. How do you represent Michigan in a time when national politics is encroaching in everything? And you read more narratives in the newspaper than you do news stories. How do you remain yourself in a world that has every hook and every influence? And how do you balance out and remain yourself when they do have those two levers to use against you, force and favors? So we're going to be watching Tom Barrett. He's kind of Michigan's homegrown congressman, so this will be fun to watch. Someone who's not a carpetbagger, someone who is one of us, who's going to go and try to represent us, and what's going to happen then, we'll be watching.